The HOA president actually called 911 because I dared to leave her precious little kingdom, but she had no idea my son was about to show up in uniform. Let me paint you a picture that'll make your blood boil. I'm standing in my own driveway on a Tuesday morning, minding my own damn business, when the rumble of diesel engines cuts through our quiet street. 2 squad cars roll up like I'm some kind of most wanted criminal. The acrid smell of exhaust mixes with my morning coffee as heavy boots crunch across the gravel. And there's Karen Whitfield, our neighborhood's self-appointed dictator, literally jumping up and down, pointing at me with her perfectly manicured talons. This woman spent 6 months making my life hell with fake violations, harassment letters, and now she's shrieking at the cops. Arrest him! He's destroying our community! His illegal fence is a menace! Illegal fence. The same fence that passed 3 inspections and follows every single HOA rule to the letter. The lead officer steps out, tall and imposing, hand resting on his radio. Karen's so busy performing her victim act that she doesn't notice him smile when he sees me. She's waving papers around like some deranged legal scholar, her voice hitting that glass-breaking pitch that makes you want to cover your ears. Then Officer Torres turns around fully, and my heart swells with pride. Hi, Dad. What seems to be the problem here? Karen's face goes whiter than her overpriced BMW. Turns out, when you spend months filing false police reports against someone, you should probably check if their kid carries a badge and arrest powers first. What would you do if your HOA president weaponized the police against you for following the rules? Drop a comment and let me know. Where are you watching from tonight? My name's Marcus Torres, and up until 14 months ago, I thought I had life figured out. 28 years as a union electrician, 3 kids who actually turned out decent, and a wife who could make even my worst days feel like sunshine. Sarah and I bought our little ranch house in Willowbrook Estates 8 years back, her dream of living somewhere safe and clean, where the kids could ride bikes without dodging potholes. Sarah passed last spring. Cancer took her fast, like it was in some kind of hurry. Left me rattling around this house with nothing but memories and our old golden retriever Buddy, who still waits by the door every evening like she might walk through it. My kids tried their best to help. Cameron's 29 now, detective with the county sheriff's department, got his dad's stubborn streak and his mom's sense of justice. Alexis works as a nurse downtown, 26 and too smart for her own good. Tyler's the baby at 22, finishing college on an engineering scholarship. They all wanted me to sell the house, move closer to one of them. But this place still smells like Sarah's lavender soap in the master bathroom, and I wasn't ready to let that go. The HOA seemed harmless enough when we moved in. $1,200 a year to keep the common areas nice, maintain the little playground, and run the clubhouse where nobody ever held any actual events. The rules were simple. Keep your grass cut. Don't paint your house neon green. Don't park boats in the driveway. Basic stuff that any decent neighbor follows anyway. Then Karen Whitfield decided she needed a hobby. Karen's been the HOA president for 6 straight years, mainly because she's the only person crazy enough to want the job. She's 48, married to some real estate lawyer named Preston, and drives a white BMW X5 with vanity plates that read HOPRES. Not even kidding. Their house is this massive colonial 4,800 square feet of constant construction noise because Karen's always improving something. But Karen's real talent isn't home renovation. It's finding new and creative ways to make your life miserable while pretending she's maintaining community standards. It started small. Karen would cruise the neighborhood in her BMW, clipboard in hand, measuring grass height with an actual ruler. She'd time people's sprinkler systems to catch violations of watering restrictions that didn't exist. But mostly she'd take pictures. Endless, obsessive photographs of garbage cans positioned 6 inches wrong, holiday decorations left up one day too long, cars parked at slightly imperfect angles in their own driveways. The breaking point came last October when I decided to install a privacy fence around my backyard. Nothing fancy, just a 4-foot cedar fence so Buddy could wander around without me worrying about him wandering into the street. I researched the HOA guidelines, got 3 contractor quotes, pulled the proper permits. Everything by the book. The fence went up on a Wednesday. Thursday morning, Karen's clicking down my sidewalk in her designer heels, measuring tape and clipboard in hand. The smell of fresh cedar shavings mixed with her overpowering perfume, some flowery assault that probably cost more than my electric bill. This fence, she announced, waving perfectly smooth legal papers, violates our aesthetic harmony clause. I pulled out my copy of the HOA rules, pointed to section 4.2 clearly stating that fences under 4 feet require no approval. Karen's nostrils flared like an angry horse. The rules, she said, lips pursed tight enough to crack walnuts, are subject to interpretation by the board. You mean subject to interpretation by you, I replied, since you are the board. That's when I learned Karen's favorite phrase, 72 hours or $500 daily, fine. I provided contractor receipts, permit documentation, city inspection certificates, didn't matter. Karen threatened an emergency board meeting to change the rules retroactively, because apparently when you're the HOA president, you can just make up new laws whenever someone hurts your feelings. That fence became Karen's obsession. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., she'd march past my house, photographing it from different angles like she was building a criminal case. Every afternoon, she'd measure the height again, hoping maybe it had grown overnight into violation territory. But the fence was just the beginning. Karen had found her new favorite target, and she was just getting warmed up. December rolled around, and I figured maybe the holidays would give Karen something else to focus on. Sarah always went all out for Christmas, not crazy overboard, but warm and welcoming. Lights outlining the roof line, a wreath on the door, maybe some garland around the porch posts, simple stuff that made the house feel alive again. I was up on the ladder the Saturday after Thanksgiving, stringing LED lights along the gutters when I heard the familiar click-click of designer heels on concrete. Karen appeared at the end of my driveway like some perfectly groomed vulture, clipboard clutched to her chest. "Those lights," she called out, not even bothering with a greeting, "are excessive." I looked around. My display was modest compared to the house 2 doors down, which looked like a casino exploded. Across the street, the Johnsons had inflatable reindeer that could probably be seen from space. But apparently my simple string of warm white LEDs was the real menace to society. "Excessive how?" I asked, climbing down from the ladder. Karen flipped through her papers with theatrical precision. The energy conservation guidelines clearly state that holiday displays must not exceed reasonable consumption standards. Here's the thing about HOA rules. They're supposed to be written down somewhere. I'd read our community guidelines front to back 3 times. There was no energy conservation clause. There was no mention of reasonable consumption standards. Karen was literally making stuff up on the spot. "Show me that rule," I said. "It's being drafted," she replied, which is HOA speak for, "I'm going to invent this rule right after I leave your driveway." She handed me a violation notice, already filled out, like she'd written it before even seeing my lights. $200 per day starting December 20th if I didn't comply with the energy conservation guidelines. The notice was signed by Preston Whitfield, attorney at law. The smell of fresh cedar shavings from my fence mixed with Karen's overpowering perfume as she stood there, waiting for me to grovel. Instead, I did something that clearly wasn't in her playbook. I smiled. That evening, I took a walk around the neighborhood. Karen's house looked like the North Pole threw up on it. Thousands of multicolored lights, animated displays, a light show synchronized to music that you could hear 3 blocks away. The Hendersons had icicle lights dripping from every surface. The Malones had a 12-foot inflatable Santa with a light-up sleigh. None of them had violation notices taped to their doors. I spent that weekend doing homework, the kind I'd learned during 28 years dealing with building inspectors and city bureaucrats. Turns out, the city had 0 restrictions on holiday lighting as long as you weren't creating traffic hazards or violating electrical codes. My union training kicked in. Always check the actual regulations, not what some supervisor tells you they say. I also discovered something interesting about Preston Whitfield. A quick search of the State Bar Association website showed he wasn't licensed to practice HOA law in our county. His specialty was commercial real estate, and he'd never handled a homeowners association case in his career. But he was sure happy to slap his law firm letterhead on Karen's made-up violations. 2 could play the research game. I created a group text with 12 neighbors, calling it Willowbrook Resistance. Nothing dramatic, just a way to coordinate. "Hey, anyone else getting harassed by Karen over Christmas lights? Let's synchronize our displays Tuesday night, 6 p.m. sharp." Tuesday evening, 12 houses lit up simultaneously across 3 streets. It was beautiful. A neighborhood united in the simple act of celebrating the holidays together. The smell of hot chocolate drifted from the Martinez's front porch where they'd set up a little cocoa stand for the kids. The sound of laughter echoed off the frost-covered lawns as families came out to see our coordinated display. Karen's BMW came screeching around the corner like she was responding to a 5-alarm fire. But here's what really got under her perfectly moisturized skin. She couldn't write violation notices to everyone at once without admitting she'd been selectively targeting people. And if she tried to take on the whole neighborhood, she'd have to enforce her fake energy conservation rule against her own house, which was using more electricity than a small shopping mall. The next morning brought Karen's counterstrike. I found a different kind of notice in my mailbox. She'd called the city's code enforcement office reporting a fire hazard at my address. She'd told them I was running illegal electrical connections that posed a danger to the neighborhood. The inspector who showed up was Rick Gonzalez, a guy I'd worked union jobs with 15 years back. Rick took one look at my professional-grade installation, properly weather-proofed connections, GFCI protection, load calculations that exceeded safety standards, and just shook his head. "Marcus, this is the cleanest holiday lighting job I've seen all season," he said, pulling out his inspection tablet. "Whoever called this in was wasting everyone's time." Then Rick mentioned something that made my blood run cold, his voice dropping to that careful tone inspectors use when they're telling you something off the record. "You're the 4th call I've gotten this month from this address range. Same complainant each time. Lady keeps filing false safety reports." That's when I realized Karen wasn't just being petty. She was weaponizing city services, filing false reports to harass neighbors she didn't like. And if she was doing it to me, she was probably doing it to others. Filing false reports with city agencies can actually get you in serious legal trouble if someone decides to push back something I filed away for future reference. The sound of extension cords snapping together in the cold winter air became the soundtrack of our rebellion. Every evening, more houses joined our synchronized light show. Karen would drive by in her BMW, engine revving with frustration, her face visible through the windshield twisted into something that looked like constipated rage. But there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. 12 houses following the exact same rules she'd tried to use against me. The beautiful irony of community solidarity wrapped in Christmas lights. Except Karen never was the type to back down from a fight, and I had a sinking feeling that Christmas lights were just her opening act. January brought a cold snap that made everything brittle, the air, the ground, and apparently Karen's patience. I thought maybe the holidays had burned out her obsession with my fence and lights. I was wrong. Karen had just been regrouping, planning her next assault on my peaceful existence. The attack came disguised as community improvement. A notice appeared in everyone's mailbox announcing the formation of the Leash Law Enforcement Committee. And the committee consisted of Karen Whitfield, chairwoman, and her loyal sidekick Martha Pembroke, a 70-year-old busybody who spent her retirement years timing how long people left their trash cans at the curb. Their first target? My 12-year-old golden retriever, Buddy. Now, Buddy's about as aggressive as a stuffed animal. His daily routine involves sleeping 18 hours, eating, and occasionally wandering onto the front lawn to retrieve the morning newspaper while I watch from the porch with my coffee. He's never been off-leash unsupervised, never bothered another soul, and his biggest crime against humanity is shedding on the couch. But according to Karen's newly minted pet policy, Buddy was a menace to society. The violation notice arrived on a Tuesday, hand-delivered by Karen herself. She stood at my front door in her designer snow boots, clipboard pressed against her puffy winter coat like armor. The paper she handed me accused Buddy of aggressive off-leash behavior in violation of community safety standards. "He walked onto my lawn," I said, reading the absurd charges, "to get the newspaper while I was standing 10 feet away." Karen's breath made little puff clouds in the freezing air as she spoke. "The leash law clearly states that all animals must be restrained at all times when outside the owner's fenced area." "What leash law?" I asked. "Show me where it's written." She pointed to a paragraph in the violation notice that referenced established community pet policies as outlined in the safety addendum. Another made-up rule. Karen was getting creative with her fictional legislation. $300 fine, she continued, plus mandatory pet behavioral assessment by a certified animal specialist. That's an additional $400. The smell of January snow mixed with her perfume as she stood there, waiting for me to collapse under the weight of her bureaucratic terrorism. Instead, I did something that clearly wasn't in her script. I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Just documenting this for my records," I said with a smile. "You don't mind, do you?" Karen's face flushed red enough to melt the frost on her Mercedes windshield. She mumbled something about 14 days to comply and clicked away down my sidewalk, her heels struggling for purchase on the icy concrete. That afternoon, I made a trip to the hardware store. Not for pet supplies, for security cameras. My years wiring commercial buildings had taught me that the best defense against workplace harassment was documentation. Every contractor learns that lesson the hard way when some supervisor tries to blame you for their screw-up. I spent the weekend installing a simple but comprehensive system. 4 cameras covering my property perimeter, all perfectly legal since they only recorded my own land. The cameras were weatherproof, motion-activated, and backed up to cloud storage automatically. Monday morning brought the first payoff. Karen's daily surveillance walk was captured in perfect high definition. There she was, trespassing on my property to photograph Buddy's food bowl, measuring the length of his chain, and here's the beautiful part, letting her own cat roam freely through 3 different yards. Snowball, Karen's pristine white Persian, apparently wasn't subject to the same leash law that terrorized poor Buddy. The footage showed Snowball stalking birds at the Hendersons' feeder, using the Martinez's garden as a litter box, and generally violating every pet policy Karen had invented for everyone else. But Karen's husband Preston wasn't about to let a little thing like hypocrisy slow down their harassment campaign. 3 days later, I found a cease and desist letter in my mailbox demanding I remove the security cameras immediately. The letter claimed my cameras violated neighborhood privacy standards and threatened legal action if I didn't comply within 72 hours. Time for some professional advice. My union benefits included legal consultation, so I scheduled a call with their attorney. Turns out, property owners can install security cameras anywhere on their own land as long as they don't record neighbors' private areas, which mine didn't. The lawyer actually laughed when I read him Preston's letter. "Tell you what," he said, "send me copies of everything they've sent you. This looks like harassment disguised as legal process." That's when things got interesting. My lawyer did some digging and discovered that Preston's law firm represented the HOA management company. Every violation fee Karen collected, Preston's firm got a percentage. They weren't just harassing me for kicks. They were literally profiting from it. I organized a responsible pet owner meetup in the neighborhood park that Saturday. 15 people showed up with their dogs, including 3 others who'd received similar violation notices from Karen's pet patrol. We compared notes while our dogs played in the snow, their breath creating little fog clouds in the cold air. Turns out Karen had been systematically targeting pet owners whose dogs she didn't like, which seemed to be every dog except her own cat. The Johnson's lab mix got cited for excessive barking during a thunderstorm. The Malone's elderly beagle was written up for aggressive posturing when it wagged its tail at a neighbor child. But here's where Karen made her first real mistake. In her zeal to persecute Buddy, she'd filed a formal complaint with the county animal control office, claiming my dog was a public safety hazard. She'd also sent copies of her violations to the city, demanding they investigate my negligent pet ownership. What Karen didn't know was that animal control keeps detailed records of all complaints. And when you file multiple false reports, especially against the same person, it starts looking less like concerned citizenship and more like harassment. The crunch of January snow under our boots became the soundtrack of our informal resistance meeting. Dog owners sharing stories, comparing Karen's ridiculous citations, and slowly realizing we weren't alone in dealing with her manufactured crises. By February, Karen's pet patrol had backfired spectacularly. Animal control had investigated her complaints and found 0 evidence of dangerous dogs in our neighborhood. Meanwhile, 3 neighbors had filed counter-complaints about Snowball's destructive roaming behavior. But if I thought Karen would back down after losing the pet battle, I clearly hadn't been paying attention to her playbook. A woman who calls the cops over Christmas lights isn't going to surrender just because her fake pet policies got exposed. She was already planning her next campaign, and this time she was aiming directly at my wallet. March arrived with that bittersweet smell of snow melting into mud, and I foolishly thought maybe Karen's harassment campaign was thawing out too. Winter had been brutal on everyone's lawns, leaving behind the usual patchwork of brown spots and dead grass that comes with Michigan weather. Most reasonable people would wait for actual spring to worry about landscaping. Karen Whitfield, however, had never been accused of being reasonable. The notice appeared in my mailbox on the first day the temperature hit 50 degrees. Spring Beautification Standards Initiative, it proclaimed in fancy letterhead that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. According to Karen's latest masterpiece, all front yards must meet professional landscaping criteria by April 30th or face daily fines of $150. The requirements read like a luxury garden center wish list: specific varieties of non-native flowers, imported decorative stones, professional-grade mulch systems, and irrigation equipment that would make a golf course jealous. The estimated cost? $2,300 minimum, according to the 3 approved vendors listed at the bottom of the notice. I walked around the neighborhood that evening, surveying the damage winter had done to everyone's lawns. The Hendersons had the same patchy grass I did. The Malone's flower beds looked like a war zone. Even Karen's own yard had brown spots under her elaborate lighting display, though I noticed her house wasn't included in the violation notices. But here's what really caught my attention. Every single approved vendor on Karen's list was charging premium prices for plants that would struggle to survive in our climate zone. These weren't native Michigan species that belonged in our soil. They were expensive ornamental varieties that would need constant watering, special fertilizers, and probably wouldn't make it through the next winter. My union background had taught me to spot a scam when I saw one. 28 years of dealing with contractors who try to upsell unnecessary work gives you a nose for bullshit. This whole beautification scheme smelled like kickbacks and inflated prices. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I researched actual landscaping options that made sense. Native plant gardening, it turns out, is not only cheaper but better for the environment. Michigan has dozens of beautiful indigenous species that thrive in our soil without constant maintenance. Even better, the city offered rebates for drought-resistant landscaping as part of their water conservation program. I designed a landscape plan using native wildflowers, prairie grasses, and local shrubs. Total cost after city rebates, $380. It would look beautiful, require minimal maintenance, and support local wildlife instead of draining the water table to keep imported flowers alive. The smell of fresh mulch and possibility filled my garage as I sorted through seed packets and native plant catalogs. This could actually be fun, creating something Sarah would have loved while thumbing my nose at Karen's expensive nonsense. I partnered with Jerry Martinez, who owned the local nursery and offered veteran discounts. Jerry had been pushing native landscaping for years, frustrated by HOAs that demanded water-wasting lawns over sustainable gardens. When I showed him Karen's approved vendor list, he just laughed. "Those guys charge triple what native plants cost," he said, loading flats of native wildflowers into my truck. "And half their recommended species will die in Michigan winters. Your plan's smarter than anything I've seen from the fancy landscape companies." By mid-March, I'd organized a neighborhood bulk buying cooperative. 8 families pooled their orders for native plants, mulch, and seeds, cutting everyone's costs by 40%. The sound of neighbors planning gardens together, sharing knowledge about soil conditions and plant spacing, felt like community the way it's supposed to work. Then Karen showed up to shut it down. She appeared at my front door on a Thursday evening, clutching her clipboard like a shield and flanked by 2 guys in expensive suits. The taller one introduced himself as Preston, her lawyer husband, while the shorter one handed me a business card identifying him as Landscape Compliance Coordinator for the management company. "Your proposed landscaping," Karen announced, "fails to meet traditional aesthetic compliance standards. The beautification committee rejects your native plant submission." I looked at Preston, then at the compliance coordinator, then back at Karen. "What beautification committee? You mean you?" "The committee," she repeated, her voice taking on that brittle edge it got when someone questioned her authority, "has determined that native landscaping creates an inconsistent neighborhood appearance. Residents must use approved vendors for approved plant varieties." That's when I realized Karen's scam was even bigger than I'd thought. She wasn't just demanding expensive landscaping, she was requiring specific contractors who were probably paying her kickbacks for the referrals. Every homeowner forced to spend $2,300 meant more money flowing through Karen and Preston's network. But Karen had made one crucial mistake. In her rush to create another money-making scheme, she'd crafted requirements that violated city environmental policies. Her approved plant list included several species that were actually restricted due to invasive characteristics. Her irrigation requirements violated municipal water conservation ordinances that had been in place for 2 years. I'd learned something important during my research into drought-resistant landscaping. Many cities now offer rebates and incentives for native plant gardens specifically because they reduce water usage and support local ecosystems. Our municipal government was actively encouraging exactly the kind of landscaping Karen was trying to ban. The next morning, I made an anonymous call to the city's water conservation office, reporting an HOA that was requiring residents to violate municipal water restrictions. I included copies of Karen's beautification standards and her approved vendor list with all their water-intensive non-native requirements. 3 days later, Karen received her own violation notice from the city. Turns out her personal yard violated 3 different municipal water restrictions she didn't even know existed. Her automatic sprinkler system was watering during prohibited hours, using restricted spray patterns, and maintaining grass coverage that exceeded city drought guidelines. The beautiful irony was almost too perfect. Karen, who'd spent months inventing fake violations for everyone else, had been breaking actual laws in her own backyard the entire time. But instead of learning from the experience, Karen doubled down. If she couldn't force me to use her expensive contractors, she'd find another way to make my life miserable. And knowing Karen's track record, it was going to get a lot worse before it got better. April brought unexpected help from the most unlikely source, my daughter Alexis. She was over for Sunday dinner, complaining about privacy regulations at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. Something about patient records and transparency laws got me thinking about HOA accountability. "You know, Dad," she said, twirling spaghetti around her fork, "if hospitals have to maintain detailed financial records that patients can inspect, I bet HOAs have similar requirements." That conversation sent me down a research rabbit hole that would change everything. Turns out homeowners associations are required by state law to maintain detailed financial records, meeting minutes, vendor contracts, and expense reports. Not only that, any resident can request to inspect these documents with reasonable notice. The HOA has 30 days to comply or face legal penalties. Monday morning, I drafted a formal records request to our management company. I wanted to see 3 years of financial statements, all vendor contracts, meeting minutes from board sessions, and expense reports for major projects. Just routine transparency that every resident had a legal right to access. Karen tried to block it immediately. She called that afternoon, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "The board," she announced, "has determined that financial records contain sensitive information that requires executive privilege protection." Executive privilege. Like she was the president of the United States instead of a small-time neighborhood dictator. "Show me where that's written in our bylaws," I said, using the same phrase that had frustrated her so many times before. It's implied in the board's fiduciary responsibilities," she stammered. I gave her 48 hours to produce the documents voluntarily. When she refused, I had my union attorney send a formal demand letter on law firm letterhead. Amazing how quickly executive privilege disappears when real legal pressure shows up. The documents arrived the following Friday in a thick manila envelope that felt heavy with secrets. What I found inside was worse than I'd imagined. The HOA had been operating at a massive deficit for 18 months. We were hemorrhaging money at a rate that would bankrupt us within 6 months. But that wasn't even the worst part. Karen had approved a $47,000 landscaping enhancement contract with Prestige Grounds Management, a company owned by Preston's brother-in-law. The work supposedly included common area improvements, irrigation upgrades, and seasonal maintenance. I'd walked every inch of our common areas. None of this work had been done. Then there was the $23,000 clubhouse renovation that consisted entirely of a fresh coat of paint and some new light fixtures. The contractor? Another relative in Preston's extended family network. But here's what really made my blood boil. Karen's violation fee collection was the only thing keeping the HOA from complete financial collapse. Every trumped-up fine, every manufactured crisis, every fake rule she invented, they were all designed to generate revenue to cover her family's embezzlement scheme. I spread the documents across my kitchen table, the smell of fresh ink mixing with my growing anger. Line by line, expense by expense, the pattern became clear. The Whitfield family had been treating our HOA like their personal ATM while terrorizing residents to pay for their theft. The management company was getting 15% commission on all violation collections. No wonder they never questioned Karen's increasingly creative interpretations of our rules. They were profiting from every fake fine she invented. But the most damning discovery was buried in the insurance paperwork. Our HOA liability coverage had lapsed 4 months ago due to unpaid premiums. Karen had been operating the association without insurance while exposing every homeowner to massive financial liability. If someone got injured in our common areas, we'd all be personally responsible for damages. That's when I realized the true scope of Karen's desperation. She wasn't just power hungry, she was covering up financial crimes that could send her and Preston to prison. Every violation notice, every harassment campaign, every attempt to force expensive compliance was part of a scheme to generate enough money to cover their tracks. The beautiful irony was that Karen's obsession with persecuting me had actually protected me. While she was focused on my fence and Christmas lights, I'd been documenting everything, building a case that could unravel their entire operation. I made copies of every document and secured them in 3 different locations. Then I started making phone calls. The State Attorney General's office has a specific division that handles HOA fraud cases. They were very interested in reviewing detailed financial records from a community association that appeared to be systematically defrauding its residents. But I also realized something that chilled me to the bone. If Karen discovered that I'd uncovered her financial crimes, she wouldn't just escalate her harassment, she'd become dangerous. Desperate people do desperate things, and Karen Whitfield was about to become very, very desperate. The next phase of this war wasn't going to be about fence heights or Christmas lights. It was going to be about covering up financial crimes, protecting reputations, and a woman who'd already shown she was willing to weaponize police reports to get what she wanted. I needed allies, and I needed them fast. Saturday morning, I fired up the coffee maker extra strong and sent a group text to the Willowbrook Resistance. Emergency backyard meeting 2 p.m. Bring lawn chairs and an open mind. Trust me on this one. By 2:15, 14 neighbors had gathered around my patio table, creating an impromptu war council that looked like a neighborhood barbecue planning committee. The smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with coffee and determination as I spread the HOA financial documents across the table like battle plans. Before we start, I said, what I'm about to show you might make you angry. Hell, it should make you angry, but more importantly, it's going to make you want to fight back. Dorothy Malone, a retired accountant with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward. Marcus, you look like someone who just discovered their accountant's been stealing from them. Close, I replied. More like someone who discovered their HOA president's been stealing from all of us. For the next hour, I walked them through Karen's financial shell game. Dorothy took notes, occasionally whistling under her breath as the numbers painted their ugly picture. Linda Martinez, who worked as a paralegal downtown, asked probing questions about contract dates and vendor relationships. This is systematic fraud, Linda said, tapping her pen against the vendor contracts. Karen and Preston have been using the HOA as their personal piggy bank while manufacturing violations to cover their theft. The group's energy shifted from curiosity to outrage as the scope of the Whitfield scheme became clear. Jerry Martinez, the nursery owner, recognized 2 of the landscaping contractors from Karen's approved vendor list. I know these guys, he said, shaking his head. They charge triple market rates and do half the work. Nobody uses them unless they're getting kickbacks. Dorothy volunteered to conduct a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances, pro bono. Her accounting firm had handled several fraud investigations, and she knew exactly what red flags to look for in the documentation. Linda offered to research our legal options under state HOA laws and consumer protection statutes. Here's what I think we need to do, I said, pulling out a legal pad covered with notes from my union days. We coordinate a comprehensive response that hits them from multiple angles simultaneously. The plan we developed over the next 2 hours was beautiful in its simplicity. First, everyone would stop paying violation fees immediately, not out of spite, but because those fees were funding criminal activity. Instead, we'd pool that money into a legal defense fund. Linda calculated that if all 14 households redirected their violation payments, we'd have over $8,000 for legal fees within a month. Second, Dorothy would complete her audit and prepare a formal complaint for the State Attorney General's office. These AG offices have specialized HOA fraud divisions that can launch criminal investigations, freeze assets, and remove corrupt board members. Third, Linda would file a petition for emergency HOA elections under state law. Karen's failure to hold proper elections for 3 years was a violation of our bylaws that could invalidate her entire presidency. Fourth, we'd demand that the management company restore our lapsed insurance coverage immediately, or face personal liability lawsuits from every homeowner. But here's where my union organizing experience became crucial. I'd learned that the key to winning against entrenched power is coordination and documentation. Every neighbor needed to document every interaction with Karen, save every violation notice, and record every board meeting. The beautiful thing about fighting corruption, I explained, is that corrupt people can't help but create evidence of their crimes. Karen's been so focused on harassing us that she's documented her own illegal activities. Linda discovered something else interesting during her research. State law requires HOA meetings to follow open meeting statutes, including proper notice to all residents and public access to discussions. Karen had been holding emergency board meetings in her living room without notifying anyone, another violation that could invalidate her decisions. We created an encrypted group chat for sharing information and coordinating responses. The sound of phone notifications pinging around the circle became our digital battle cry as neighbors shared photos of violation notices, recorded audio from Karen's confrontations, and documented her daily surveillance activities. Jerry offered his nursery as a meeting location if we needed somewhere more private than my backyard. Dorothy suggested we rotate meeting locations to prevent Karen from infiltrating our planning sessions. Linda warned everyone to keep detailed calendars of all HOA-related interactions for potential legal proceedings. But the most important part of our strategy was patience. Karen had been operating her scam for years, and she'd gotten sloppy because no one had challenged her before. Now that she was facing organized resistance, she'd make mistakes, and we'd be ready to document every one. Remember, I told the group as we wrapped up the meeting, we're not trying to destroy Karen out of spite. We're protecting our community from financial criminals who've been stealing from us while pretending to enforce rules. The crunch of gravel under departing cars mixed with the evening sounds of a neighborhood that finally felt united in purpose. For the first time in months, I wasn't facing Karen's harassment alone. I had allies, evidence, and a plan. But I also had a growing suspicion that Karen wasn't going to surrender quietly. A woman who'd weaponized police reports and false safety complaints wouldn't hesitate to escalate when her criminal enterprise faced exposure. The next phase of this fight wasn't going to be about community organizing and legal documents. It was going to be about a cornered predator lashing out with everything she had left. And knowing Karen, that was going to be plenty dangerous. May arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that makes you forget about winter's cruelties. But Karen Whitfield had become a different kind of seasonal affliction, one that got worse as the temperature rose. Our coordinated resistance had clearly rattled her, and a rattled Karen was a dangerous Karen. The first sign of trouble came through social media. I'd never been much for Facebook, but Alexis insisted I needed to monitor what people were saying about our neighborhood situation. Turns out Karen had been busy crafting her own narrative on the Willowbrook Estates community page. According to her posts, I was a disgruntled resident who was organizing dissent against community standards and threatening the safety and property values of law-abiding homeowners. She'd somehow twisted our native plant landscaping initiative into an environmental extremist plot, complete with warnings about how drought-resistant gardens would attract vermin and undesirable wildlife. But Karen's social media campaign was just the opening salvo. 3 days later, she filed a police report claiming I'd threatened her with physical violence during a neighborhood encounter that had never happened. According to her statement, I'd cornered her near the mailboxes and made intimidating gestures while demanding she back off or else. The problem with Karen's story was my security cameras. I had clear footage showing that I hadn't left my property that day except to drive to the grocery store, and Karen had never been near our mailboxes. But filing false police reports was becoming Karen's signature move, and she was getting bolder about it. My son Cameron called that evening, his voice careful and professional in that way cops use when they're delivering bad news to family. "Dad, I need to give you a heads up. Someone filed a complaint alleging you threatened them. I can't get involved officially, but you might want to document your whereabouts more carefully." The next escalation came through my former employer. I'd been retired for 6 months, but Karen somehow got the brilliant idea to call my old union hall and report me for unethical conduct and threatening behavior toward community members. She demanded they investigate my pattern of intimidation and revoke any professional certifications I might still hold. The union rep who called me was laughing by the time he finished explaining Karen's complaint. "Marcus, this lady claims you're running some kind of neighborhood crime syndicate. She wants us to discipline you for organizing residents to follow HOA bylaws." I had to read her statement 3 times to figure out what she was actually complaining about. But Karen's desperation was becoming systematic. She'd started calling city code enforcement daily with new complaints about my property, noise violations for running a lawnmower at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, zoning complaints claiming I was operating an illegal business because neighbors visited my house for planning meetings, environmental violations alleging I was dumping chemicals because she'd seen me watering my native plants with a garden hose. Each false report required a city inspector to waste time investigating obvious nonsense. Rick Gonzalez, my old union buddy who'd inspected my Christmas lights, finally called me directly. "Marcus, you need to know this lady has filed 17 complaints about your property in the past month. 17. We've investigated every single one and found 0 violations. At this point, she's abusing the system." Rick's call was a wake-up moment. Karen wasn't just harassing me anymore, she was wasting taxpayer money and city resources with her manufactured crises. Filing false reports with government agencies is a serious crime, especially when there's a clear pattern of malicious intent. That's when Karen played her nuclear card. She and Preston hired a private investigator to conduct a thorough background investigation into my personal life, looking for anything they could use to discredit me or my family. They wanted dirt on my finances, my marriage, my kids' records, anything that could be weaponized in their escalating harassment campaign. The PI they hired made a crucial mistake. He was a former cop who recognized Cameron's name from the police reports Karen had been filing. Instead of conducting surveillance on our family, he called Cameron directly and warned him about his parents' scheme. "Detective Torres, this is Jake Mitchell, private investigator. I need to talk to you about your father. Someone hired me to dig up information on your family, but I think you should know what's going on here." Jake had been in law enforcement for 15 years before going private, and he recognized a harassment campaign when he saw one. He'd actually investigated Karen in 2 other jurisdictions where she'd targeted previous neighbors with similar tactics. Apparently, the Whitfields had been running this same playbook in different communities for over a decade. "Your dad's not the first person she's done this to," Jake explained to Cameron. "I've got files on 3 other neighborhoods where she pulled identical schemes. Always the same pattern manufactured violations, fake rules, harassment campaigns, then private investigators when people fight back." Jake provided Cameron with evidence showing Karen's history of targeting neighbors she didn't like, filing false reports, and escalating to threats and private surveillance when her victims organized resistance. It was a pattern of criminal behavior spanning multiple communities in several years. But here's what really worried me. Karen's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and public. The woman who'd once been calculated and methodical in her harassment was now making desperate moves that exposed her to serious legal consequences. She was cornered, and cornered animals are dangerous. The sound of my phone buzzing with updates from neighbors reporting Karen's latest bizarre behavior, photographing their garbage cans at dawn, measuring their sprinkler coverage with a tape measure, confronting visitors to document their license plates, created a constant soundtrack of escalating tension. My union experience had taught me that when management gets desperate enough to hire private investigators and file false reports, they're preparing for scorched earth tactics. They'd rather destroy everything than admit they were wrong and face consequences for their actions. Karen Whitfield was about to prove that lesson in the most dramatic way possible, and unfortunately, my family was about to be dragged directly into the line of fire. June arrived like a fever breaking, and Karen's behavior reached levels of desperation that would have been comedic if they weren't so potentially dangerous. The woman who'd once prided herself on subtle manipulation and bureaucratic warfare had abandoned all pretense of rationality. Her latest scheme was breathtaking in its audacity: an emergency HOA meeting to vote me out of the neighborhood entirely. Never mind that HOAs can't actually evict homeowners for following the rules. Karen had apparently convinced herself that if she could gather enough signatures, she could somehow force me to sell my house and leave Willowbrook Estates forever. The meeting notice appeared in mailboxes on a Wednesday evening, printed on expensive letterhead that probably cost more than most people's grocery bills. "Emergency Community Safety Session," it proclaimed, scheduled for the following Saturday at the clubhouse. The agenda included discussion of resident conduct issues, community safety concerns, and protective measures for law-abiding homeowners. Karen had been busy canvassing the neighborhood for support, going door to door with a clipboard and what I could only describe as manic energy. Neighbors reported that she'd been talking faster than usual, gesturing wildly, and making increasingly outlandish claims about my dangerous influence on community stability. According to Martha Pembroke, who lived next door to the Hendersons, Karen's sales pitch had evolved into something resembling a conspiracy theory. Apparently, I was now the ringleader of an anti-HOA extremist group that was planning to destroy property values through intentional rule violations and neighborhood destabilization. The beautiful irony was that Karen's door-to-door campaign was backfiring spectacularly. Every neighbor she visited got to hear her increasingly unhinged theories about my supposed crimes, which made our actual evidence of her financial fraud seem even more credible by comparison. But Karen wasn't just relying on community support for her final gambit. She'd assembled what she probably thought was an intimidating legal team. Preston, another lawyer from his firm, and some guy who claimed to be a community compliance specialist, but looked more like hired muscle in a cheap suit. Saturday evening arrived with that golden light that makes suburban neighborhoods look like movie sets, but the atmosphere around our clubhouse felt more like a courtroom drama. 47 residents showed up, the largest HOA meeting attendance in our community's history. Karen arrived early, setting up her presentation materials with the manic precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in her bathroom mirror. She'd brought charts, printed photographs of my property from various angles, and what appeared to be a PowerPoint presentation titled, "Protecting Our Community Values." I walked in 15 minutes before the scheduled start time with Dorothy, Linda, and 14 other neighbors who'd become the core of our resistance movement. We carried our own evidence boxes, Dorothy's completed financial audit, Linda's legal research, and 3 years of documented harassment that painted a very different picture of who was threatening our community. The local newspaper reporter was already there, notebook ready and camera in hand. Linda had tipped him off about the HOA corruption story, and he was eager to document whatever was about to unfold. Karen clearly hadn't expected media attention, and the sight of a professional journalist taking notes made her even more visibly agitated. "This meeting," Karen announced, calling the session to order with theatrical authority, "has been called to address the serious threat posed by certain residents who have chosen to undermine our community standards through organized resistance to legitimate board authority." She launched into her prepared presentation, displaying photographs of my fence, my Christmas lights, and my native plant garden as if they were evidence of capital crimes. Her voice rose and fell dramatically as she described the chaos and discord that my rebellious attitude had brought to our peaceful neighborhood. "This individual," she continued, pointing directly at me while Preston nodded solemnly beside her, "has organized systematic defiance of community rules, encouraged others to violate established standards, and created a hostile environment that threatens the safety and property values of law-abiding residents." When Karen finished her 20-minute presentation, Linda stood up calmly and announced that she was recording the proceedings for legal purposes. She explained that residents had the right to document official HOA meetings, especially when they involved allegations of misconduct. "Mrs. Whitfield," Linda said, her paralegal training evident in her professional tone, "before this meeting proceeds further, I need to inform everyone present that this gathering appears to violate several state laws governing HOA meetings, including proper notice requirements and open meeting statutes." That's when Dorothy stepped forward with her audit findings. In her clear accountant's voice, she began reading aloud the financial irregularities she'd discovered. The $47,000 in landscaping contracts for work that was never performed, the $23,000 in clubhouse renovations that consisted of a paint job, and the systematically inflated vendor contracts that had enriched Preston's family while bankrupting our community association. Karen's face went from confident to pale to bright red as Dorothy methodically dismantled the Whitfields' financial house of cards in front of 47 witnesses and a newspaper reporter. Preston tried to interrupt several times, claiming the financial information was privileged and taken out of context, but Dorothy had documentation for every allegation. "In conclusion," Dorothy said, adjusting her glasses as she reached the final page of her report, "the HOA has been operated as a personal enrichment scheme for the board president and her husband, with manufactured violations used to generate revenue to cover systematic embezzlement of community funds." The room erupted. Neighbors who'd been targeted by Karen's harassment campaigns started sharing their own stories. The manufactured pet violations, the fake landscaping requirements, the invented energy conservation rules, every scam Karen had run was exposed in front of the entire community. That's when Karen made her final, desperate play. She pulled out her cell phone and called 911, claiming there was a riot situation developing at the community meeting and demanding immediate police response to remove disruptive individuals who are threatening community safety. "I need police at the Willowbrook Estates clubhouse immediately," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. We have a dangerous situation with residents making threats and creating public disturbance. Send multiple units, this could get violent. The beautiful thing about Karen's dramatic phone call was that 47 witnesses heard her file what was obviously a false police report. We were sitting in folding chairs discussing financial documents. The most threatening thing in the room was probably the stale coffee someone had made in the clubhouse kitchen. But Karen had committed herself to this final performance, and she was going to play it to the end. She stood behind the presentation table like it was a fortress, Preston at her side looking like he wanted to disappear, while the rest of us waited to see what would happen when the police arrived expecting a riot and found a community meeting instead. The sound of sirens approaching in the distance created the perfect soundtrack for Karen's last stand. She'd weaponized false police reports one too many times, and this time she'd done it in front of dozens of witnesses and a newspaper reporter. Justice, it turned out, was about to arrive wearing a badge and driving a patrol car. And for once, Karen Whitfield wasn't going to be the one pointing fingers when the officers walked through that door. The sound of multiple patrol cars pulling into the clubhouse parking lot created a tense silence that you could practically taste. Diesel engines idling, radio chatter crackling through open windows, and the unmistakable crunch of gravel under heavy boots as officers approached the building. Karen stood behind her makeshift presentation table like a general preparing for battle, her face flushed with righteous indignation. 3 uniformed officers entered through the main door, hands resting casually on their utility belts, eyes scanning the room for signs of the riot situation they'd been dispatched to handle. What they found instead was 47 people sitting quietly in folding chairs, surrounded by financial documents and poster boards that looked more like a PTA meeting than a public disturbance. The lead officer, a tall sergeant with graying temples, looked around the room with the practiced eye of someone who'd responded to thousands of calls over his career. "We received a report of a disturbance at this location. Can someone explain what's going on here?" Karen practically launched herself from behind the table, pointing dramatically at me like she was identifying a fugitive. "Officer, thank you for responding so quickly. That man," she declared, her voice carrying that shrill edge it got when she was really worked up, "has been threatening our community, organizing illegal activities, and creating a dangerous situation for law-abiding residents." The sergeant looked from Karen to me, then to the room full of neighbors sitting peacefully with notebooks and coffee cups. "Ma'am, can you be more specific about the nature of these threats?" "He's been systematically violating community standards, organizing resistance to legitimate board authority, and intimidating residents who try to enforce our rules," Karen continued, her gestures becoming more animated with each accusation. "He's created a hostile environment that threatens everyone's safety and property values." That's when the second officer turned around from where he'd been surveying the room, and my heart filled with that special kind of pride that only a parent can feel. Detective Cameron Torres, in full uniform, complete with sergeant stripes, and that confident bearing that comes with years of experience and natural authority. "Hi, Dad," he said with a slight smile. "What seems to be the problem here?" The transformation in Karen's face was something that 47 witnesses and 1 newspaper reporter would never forget. The color drained from her cheeks faster than water down a storm drain, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, gasping for air. Preston, standing beside her, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. This is," Karen stammered, clearly trying to process how the officer she'd called to arrest me had just addressed me as Dad. Cameron maintained his professional demeanor, pulling out his notebook with practiced efficiency. "Ma'am, you called 911 reporting a riot situation with threats of violence. Can you explain specifically what threats were made and by whom?" Karen's eyes darted around the room, looking for support from neighbors who were now staring at her with expressions ranging from disbelief to outright hostility. The woman who'd spent months filing false police reports had finally done it in front of enough witnesses to end her reign of terror. They, she gestured wildly at our group. "They've been disrupting our community meeting, making accusations, refusing to follow proper procedures." Linda Martinez stood up slowly, her paralegal training evident in her calm professional bearing. "Officer Torres, I'm Linda Martinez, and I've been recording this meeting for legal documentation purposes. Mrs. Whitfield called this emergency session to demand that Mr. Torres be removed from the neighborhood for alleged rule violations. We responded by presenting evidence of systematic financial fraud committed by Mrs. Whitfield and her husband. She handed Cameron a folder containing Dorothy's audit findings, the documented harassment timeline, and copies of every false police report Karen had filed over the past 6 months. Mrs. Whitfield has filed 17 false complaints with city agencies, multiple fraudulent police reports, and has been systematically embezzling HOA funds while manufacturing violations to cover her theft, Linda continued. Tonight's 911 call appears to be another false report in a documented pattern of abuse of emergency services. Cameron reviewed the documents with the thorough attention that had made him a respected detective. Meanwhile, Karen was becoming increasingly agitated, realizing that her final gambit had backfired spectacularly. "This is a setup," she declared, her voice reaching that glass-breaking pitch. "You're all conspiring against me. This is harassment. I demand you arrest these people for threatening me." The newspaper reporter was frantically scribbling notes while his photographer captured Karen's meltdown for the front page of next week's community section. Dorothy Malone sat calmly in her folding chair, financial documents spread before her like evidence in a courtroom. Cameron looked up from the documentation, his expression shifting from professional interest to serious concern. "Mrs. Whitfield, based on the evidence presented here and the circumstances of tonight's call, I need to inform you that filing false police reports is a felony offense under state law." "False reports?" Karen's voice cracked. "I called because these people were threatening me. They were disrupting our meeting. They were making me feel unsafe." "Ma'am," Cameron replied calmly, "I've been in this room for 10 minutes. Everyone is sitting quietly, discussing financial documents. There's no evidence of threats, violence, or public disturbance. However, there is clear evidence that you knowingly filed a false emergency report." That's when Preston finally spoke up, his lawyer instincts kicking in too late to save his wife's situation. "Officer, perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. My wife was genuinely concerned about—" "Mr. Whitfield," Cameron interrupted, "are you aware that filing false police reports is a criminal offense that can result in felony charges, especially when there's a documented pattern of abuse?" The room fell silent except for the sound of Karen's increasingly panicked breathing and the distant hum of patrol car engines still idling outside. 47 neighbors watched as the woman who'd terrorized their community for years finally faced the consequences of her actions. Cameron pulled out his handcuffs with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. "Mrs. Whitfield, you're under arrest for filing a false police report. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the Miranda rights echoed through the clubhouse, Karen Whitfield, HOA president, neighborhood dictator, and small-time criminal, was handcuffed and led out past the very residence she'd spent months trying to intimidate into submission. The sound of car doors slamming and engines pulling away marked the end of Karen's reign of terror. What remained was a room full of neighbors who'd finally seen justice served, a newspaper reporter with the story of his career, and the sweet satisfaction of a community that had stood up to corruption and won. The weeks following Karen's arrest felt like watching a neighborhood wake up from a long, unpleasant dream. The sound of handcuffs clicking that evening at the clubhouse seemed to break some kind of spell that had been hanging over Willowbrook Estates for months. Karen was formally charged with filing false police reports, a felony that carried real jail time, along with harassment and fraud charges stemming from Dorothy's forensic audit. Preston faced disciplinary proceedings with the State Bar Association and lost all his HOA management contracts when word spread about his role in the embezzlement scheme. Their carefully constructed house of cards collapsed faster than a demolition project. Within 60 days, we'd elected a new HOA board with Dorothy Malone as president and Linda Martinez as treasurer. I declined the nomination for president. I'd had enough of HOA politics to last several lifetimes. The new board's first act was hiring a licensed, bonded management company that actually followed state laws instead of making them up. All those fraudulent violation fees, refunded in full. $23,000 returned to residents who'd been systematically scammed by Karen's manufactured crises. My Christmas light fine, my pet violation penalties, my landscaping compliance fees, every penny came back with interest and a formal apology from the new board. But the real healing began 3 weekends later when we held what Dorothy dubbed the Unity BBQ in my backyard. 38 families showed up, bringing covered dishes and stories they'd never shared before. Turned out, Karen's harassment hadn't been limited to the obvious targets. She'd been terrorizing people quietly for years, and most residents had assumed they were alone in dealing with her manufactured crises. The smell of grilled burgers mixing with Dorothy's famous potato salad and the sound of kids playing in my backyard created the kind of neighborhood atmosphere Sarah would have loved. Buddy wandered freely among the guests, finally able to enjoy being a normal dog without fear of violation notices for aggressive tail wagging or intimidating friendly behavior. Jerry Martinez brought native plant seedlings for everyone, turning Karen's expensive landscaping requirements into a community garden project that actually improved our environment instead of draining our wallets. The Hendersons installed a little lending library where Karen's violation notice box used to hang. The Johnsons started a tool-sharing program that eliminated the need for everyone to own identical lawn equipment. 6 months after the arrest, I got an unexpected call that brought everything full circle. Dorothy had started dating again. Something about fighting corruption together had sparked a romance that surprised both of us. We'd moved slowly and carefully, both of us carrying the tender spots that come with losing spouses, but Sarah's memory felt comfortable around Dorothy's gentle strength. "You know," Dorothy said one evening as we sat on my back porch watching Buddy chase fireflies, "Sarah would be proud of what you did. Standing up for the neighborhood, bringing everyone together, not letting the bullies win." The new HOA board established the Sarah Torres Memorial Scholarship Fund, using money saved from eliminating Karen's unnecessary vendor contracts and inflated management fees. 3 local high school students received scholarships that first year, with funding for more as our community's finances recovered from the Whitfield embezzlement. I started volunteering at the high school, teaching electrical safety to kids in the trade programs. Turns out 40 years of union experience translates pretty well to helping teenagers understand circuit breakers and proper grounding techniques. Plus, it felt good to pass along practical skills that could help kids build real careers instead of just memorizing test answers. The annual Community Safety Day became a Willowbrook tradition, with local first responders teaching everything from CPR to home security. Cameron participated every year, demonstrating proper emergency response procedures and explaining how residents could work with law enforcement instead of against it. No more false reports, no more manufactured crises, just neighbors helping neighbors stay safe. Karen's legal resolution took longer than anyone expected. She eventually pled guilty to multiple felony charges and received 6 months in county jail, 2 years probation, and 400 hours of community service. The judge also ordered her to pay restitution to the HOA and banned her from serving on any community association board for 10 years. Preston lost his law license for a year and paid $50,000 in fines to the State Bar Association. Their house went on the market 8 months after Karen's arrest, sold quickly to a young family with twins who thought the neighborhood looked peaceful and family-friendly. 3 other communities came forward after seeing our story in the newspaper, reporting similar harassment campaigns by Karen in previous neighborhoods where she'd lived. Apparently, the Whitfields had been running versions of this same scam for over a decade, always moving on before anyone organized effective resistance. The most satisfying justice came 18 months later when the HOA received a $125,000 settlement from our former management company's insurance policy. Turns out they'd been systematically defrauding multiple communities, and our documentation helped prosecutors build cases that recovered money for hundreds of families. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was walking through a neighborhood where kids played freely, where neighbors talked to each other without fear of violation notices, where community gardens grew, where harassment campaigns once flourished. The sound of laughter at block parties replaced the click of designer heels on surveillance walks. My union background had taught me that ordinary people can defeat corrupt systems when they organize, document everything, and refuse to be intimidated. Karen's biggest mistake was underestimating a neighborhood full of people who were tired of being bullied and ready to fight back together. Looking back, I realized the most important lesson wasn't about HOA law or financial fraud, it was about community. Sarah had dreamed of living somewhere safe and clean, where neighbors looked out for each other. It just took a few years and one corrupt HOA president to teach us how to actually build that kind of community ourselves. So here's what I want you to remember. Document everything, know your rights, and never assume you're fighting alone. Someone else in your neighborhood is probably dealing with the same petty tyranny, and together, you're stronger than any small-time dictator with a clipboard and delusions of grandeur. Drop a comment sharing your HOA nightmare story. You're not alone in dealing with petty tyrants who think a little authority makes them untouchable. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about standing up to corrupt authority and winning through persistence and principle. Next week, how my neighbor tried to steal my inheritance and ended up losing his own house. Because apparently, some people never learn that crime doesn't pay, especially when your victim knows how to use a camera and read the fine print.
That's all for today's HOA madness. If watching justice serve itself made your day, smash that like button, share your thoughts down below, and make sure you're subscribed. More outrageous neighborhood showdowns are just around the corner.